All right, I think we'll get started and we'll let people trickle in during the introductions. So hello, everyone, and welcome to PGTME's fifth annual Lunchtime Lecture Series. My name is Aiden Ilmes. I'm the program coordinator of PGTME, and our moderator and panelists will be introducing themselves shortly. We are so grateful to have you all here for our fifth year of hosting this event. We are always impressed and inspired by the diverse group of attendees and thoughtful engagement. PGTME is a project of the Division of Medical Ethics housed in NYU Grossman School of Medicine's Department of Population Health and is funded in part by a gift from Parent Project Muscular Dystrophy. You can learn more about PGTME from our webpage, which John will drop a link to in the chat, as well as information on how to join our mailing list to receive our quarterly newsletter and keep up to date with our work. We're very excited to hear from today's speakers for our panel, What's Up with Long-Term Follow-Up, Ethical, Regulatory, and Operational Challenges. This session is co-sponsored by the Multi-Regional Clinical Trials Center of Brigham and Women's Hospital and Harvard, and we'll put information for them in the chat as well. If you're unable to attend any of our talks throughout the week, we'll be posting captioned recordings once the week is concluded, and we will share the link with all registrants. Today's event will feature brief introductions by our panelists, followed by a moderated discussion. We've also allowed at least 15 minutes for audience Q&A at the end, and we encourage you to submit questions throughout the conversation using the Q&A function. Without further ado, I'm going to hand it off to our moderator, Dr. Carolyn Chapman, who is a member of the faculty of the Department of Medicine at Harvard Medical School and lead investigator in the Division of Global Health Equity in the Department of Medicine at Brigham and Women's Hospital, as well as one of our PGTME members, to introduce herself and the rest of the panel. Carolyn, take it away.
Thank you so much, Aiden, and thank you to everyone for joining us today. As Aiden said, my name is Carolyn Chapman, and I lead the Cell and Gene Therapies project at the Multi-Regional Clinical Trial Center of Brigham and Women's Hospital and Harvard, otherwise known as the MRCT Center for short. Just briefly, the MRCT Center is an applied policy center focused on addressing the conduct, oversight, ethics, and regulatory environment for clinical trials around the world. As Aiden said, I'm also a proud current member of PGTME, and I previously worked at NYU's Division of Medical Ethics. So I'm really excited for this webinar, which is focused on long-term follow-up studies and commitments in the context of gene therapies, including genetically modified cell therapies. And this topic has also come up previously in the series this week, and so we're going to dive even a bit further into it today. We are especially grateful to our panelists for being willing to share their perspectives with us. Our conversation will benefit from learning from their diverse viewpoints. As they will tell you, and I'll ask them to introduce themselves in just a moment, we have a representative from the FDA, Dr. Najat Bouchkouj, Bluebird Bio's head of clinical research and development, Dr. Himal Thakar, a clinician investigator from St. Jude Children's Hospital, Dr. Aimee Talleur, and last but certainly not least, a parent who just so happens to also be a pediatrician, Dr. Priya. To keep the conversation casual, we're just going to use first names only today, but I do want to note that all of our panelists have MDs. And, I wanted to start out by just taking a moment now to ground everybody on what we mean by long-term follow-up studies in the context of gene therapies. Long-term follow-up studies are conducted to improve the understanding of the overall long-term safety profile of some types of gene therapy products. In essence, long-term follow-up studies refer to an extended monitoring or assessment period to better understand and mitigate the risk of delayed adverse events. These extended periods vary in duration, but may be 5 years, 15 years, or even last a lifetime. The reason that long-term follow-up studies are considered and recommended in the context of gene therapies is because gene therapies, particularly those which modify, replace, or add DNA, are often intended to make permanent or long-lasting changes to human cells. The hope is that these long-lasting changes will have long-lasting beneficial health effects. But the flip side is that these long-lasting changes can also have the potential for delayed detrimental effects, such as the development of cancer, immunological implications, or toxicities. And that's why long-term follow-up studies are so important to understand the overall benefit risk profile of certain gene therapy products. Although the primary purpose is to understand long-term safety, long-term follow-up may also measure the persistence of the product. In other words, how long it lasts and where it goes. And it may also include assessments for long-term efficacy or disease-specific outcomes. The overall risk-benefit profile of gene therapy products is important information to many different parties and for various reasons. Of course, patients, caregivers, and their physicians want this information to help their decision-making about research and treatment options. Companies may also want this information to guide future investment and development, including potential expansion to broader patient populations and better understand the value of these products. Regulators want to understand the overall safety and efficacy of products to fulfill their obligations and protect the public. Payers and insurers want this data to be able to value and determine appropriate reimbursement. Individuals participating in long-term follow-up studies for gene therapies may have received an investigational gene therapy as a research participant in a clinical trial or via expanded access. Alternatively, the people who are participating in long-term follow-up may have received approved gene therapy products in a post-market authorization or commercial setting. Also, I just want to mention that long-term follow-up can be accomplished through a variety of mechanisms, such as an extension of an interventional clinical trial or the establishment of standalone long-term follow-up protocols. Other forms of long-term follow-up include the use of registries, patient registries, and more broadly speaking, we might also even consider post-marketing surveillance mechanisms, such as the FDA Adverse Event Reporting System, or FAERS, as a form of long-term follow-up as well, or at least a complementary method for assessing long-term outcomes. As we will discuss today, there's broad agreement that long-term follow-up studies are important in the context of gene therapies. However, there's also widespread recognition that long-term follow-up studies are challenging to design and conduct and pose a significant burden, particularly on patients and families, but also on sponsors, researchers, and the healthcare system. These issues are actually not new, and if you look in the literature, they've been discussed for decades. But because of the recent success of gene therapies, there are now 22 approved gene therapies in the US and hundreds more in development. There's increased attention on these challenges. Today's conversation is aimed at better understanding long-term follow-up studies and also hopefully discussing ideas about improving their design and conduct to maximize their scientific and social value and minimize their burdens, striking the right balance, if you will. So with that brief but hopefully helpful overview, I'm now going to ask our panelists to briefly introduce themselves, including sharing how they are connected to long-term follow-up. And Priya, why don't we start with you?
Hi, everyone. My name is Priya Stephen. I'm a pediatrician. I'm a member of the board of directors of the Wiskott-Aldrich Foundation, and I'm the parent of a child who received gene therapy 13 years ago. So in my work with the Wiskott Foundation, working with parents and doing patient advocacy, I've met many families in their journeys. So I hope that I can share their perspectives as well as my own experience as a parent. We received gene therapy as part of an investigational trial. So that's been my experience has been really as part of a trial. So I can speak to that.
Thank you so much, Priya. Aimee?
Hi, everyone. Thank you for letting me be a part of this panel. So my name is Dr. Aimee Talleur. I'm an associate member in the Department of Bone Marrow Transplant and Cellular Therapy at St. Jude Children's Research Hospital. And so what that means is that both clinically and from a research standpoint, I investigate novel immune therapies or these genetically modified cells, specifically CAR T cells, for the treatment of pediatric and teenagers and young adult patients with high-risk cancers, typically leukemias. I'm also very interested in better understanding toxicities of these therapies. I've focused a lot of my work on the short-term toxicities, but really recently have begun to recognize and get involved in really the unknowns of what the late effects are in this patient population. And so to that, I'm leading a first-of-a-kind effort in the pediatric space to evaluate the late effects after CAR T-cell therapy.
Thank you so much, Aimee. Himal?
Yeah, hi, my name is Himal Thakar. I'm the head of clinical research and development at bluebird Bio. I've been at the company for almost 4 years. And I supervise all the 6 long-term follow-up studies we have at Bluebird Bio. In terms of conflict of interest, I want to be upfront. I am a paid employee of Bluebird Bio, and I receive stock and stock options as part of compensation. Thank you.
Thank you. And Najat?
Yeah, hi everyone. And again, thank you for inviting me to be a part of this panel. So I'm Najat Bouchkouj, and I am a pediatric hematologist oncologist by training. And I am currently the Associate Director for Pediatrics at the Office of Clinical Evaluation at the Office of Therapeutic Products within CBER. I've joined the FDA, CBER, over 8 years ago in the hematology branch. And my current role, I provide support and guidance to the clinical staff, advise the clinical office director on the development, implementation of regulatory, scientific, and policy initiatives that advance the development of cell and gene therapy products for pediatric patients. And that is across all indications, malignant hematology, oncology, as well as general medicine indications. In addition, I continue to see patients in the oncology late effect clinic at Children's National Medical Center here in DC.
Great. Thank you so much, all of you, for being with us. Najat, I'm going to ask you to maybe start off by sharing a bit more about the FDA's perspective, a little bit more detail about long-term follow-up studies and how they came about, and the regulatory perspective.
Sure. So as you all know, relative to other classes of drugs and biological products, cell and gene therapy products are novel. They're exciting therapies. They hold a lot of promise, and several had already been approved and had a lot of or large impact on patients. But again, with the novelty of this class products comes uncertainty regarding, long-term risks. So long-term follow-up is really critical in many aspects. I think most importantly, as you alluded to, the evaluation of certain rare adverse events. As you know, some adverse events may not be observable in the initial clinical trials due to small sample size, relatively short follow-up periods during the clinical trial. And long-term data helps identify these rare or late onset adverse events that may take several years to emerge. Cell and gene therapy in general often involves, as you mentioned, genetic modifications or the introduction of live cells into the patient's body, which can have long-term or delayed effects. For example, there may be risks of either immune reactions, something that we call insertion mutagenesis, where the inserted gene disrupts normal cell function, or the development of cancers or other unexpected complications that might not become apparent in the short term during the clinical trial. So understanding long-term health impacts also is very important. These therapies may have broader impacts on the patient's health beyond just the intended effect. When patients make decision in deciding whether to enroll in a clinical trial, for example, or to receive an approved gene therapy product, they need to make an informed decision. Long-term data enables, healthcare providers, patients, their care partners, regulators to make more informed decisions about the benefits and risk, for these therapies, helping guide the patient care, policy decisions, and future drug development. So in terms of, our role at the FDA is really to ensure that novel therapies are regularly monitored, both before and after approval. The FDA may require long-term follow-up, typically ranging between 5 to 15 years, depending on the product and how it's manufactured and what's used for the manufacturing. And this is really to assess mainly the risk profile of these novel treatments. Post-approval, maybe these follow-ups can monitor durability of effects, but again, I think our main focus is mainly for the safety during the clinical trials and again after the drug approvals. Again, this ensures that these therapies are not only effective or safe in the short term, but also safe long term in the general population once the drugs are approved. And typically, upon approval, the FDA may require respective product manufacturer to conduct either a safety study for follow-up, to follow up and capture serious safety risks that may emerge, secondary cancers, for example, or other serious adverse events. Before the approval, the long-term follow-up also is necessary so that we can monitor these effects as well. We do issue guidance documents to help gene therapy developers design appropriate long-term follow-up protocols. We can put perhaps in the chat a little bit later a link to the guidance. There is a guidance that was finalized that really helps developers on the adequate design of such studies. It includes recommendations on the type of data that to be collected and duration of follow-up based on the products, based on the disease that is being treated, and the handling of potential complications. So just to summarize, long-term follow-up studies are really critical to ensure the safety and overall favorable benefit risk for these products during the clinical trial as well as post-approvals when they go to the patients.
Thank you so much, Najat. So next, I think we were going to go with to Himal. Himal is going to share how long-term follow-up commitments have been approached and realized in the process of developing gene therapies that are now approved and on the market. So Himal, thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you, Dr. Najat, for describing why long-term follow-up studies are conducted. I will speak about our experience in establishing long-term follow-up studies in the context of clinical development and in real-world post-marketing settings. I will give some specific examples to help the audience. So the FDA guidance on long-term follow-up studies serves as a very useful reference, and a long-term follow-up study is ultimately developed following consultation between the FDA and the sponsor. So long-term data can be collected in many ways, such as observation studies, chart reviews, registries, questionnaires, and review of health insurance data. But these designs will generally not work for gene therapies developed with integrating vectors where specific follow-up and testing is needed. Bluebird Bio has 6 ongoing long-term follow-up studies for 3 approved gene therapies. 3 studies are for patients who receive gene therapies in clinical trials prior to regulatory approval, and 3 are for patients in the post-marketing setting. And in all studies, patients will be followed for 15 years as part of long-term follow-up. In pre-approval setting, when we designed the long-term follow-up studies for patients who were enrolling in clinical trials, we went above and beyond the FDA guidance because we wanted to better understand safety, efficacy, and durability of our gene therapies, as was pointed out earlier. So these studies had extensive testing and monitoring, somewhat similar to our clinical trial patients. In the post-marketing setting, things are slightly different because we adapted based on what we learned from our clinical trials. This did not mean that there was less frequent testing or monitoring in the post-marketing setting. In one of our post-marketing long-term follow-up study, we have less frequent testing, but in the other, we do have more frequent testing. And someone may ask, how is that? The answer is very simple. With one of the gene therapies, there was a desire to better understand some lab abnormalities in one of the clinical trials in the first year. And this desire can come from either the sponsor, the FDA, or the treating physicians. So the first lesson we learned is to incorporate learnings from previous clinical trials. One should also keep in mind that a large number of patients are treated in post-marketing setting. So a long-term follow-up study can also be used to understand product better, not only in the long term, but also in the short and the medium term. And this is an important point everyone should, I think, recognize. Gene therapies are frequently used to treat rare diseases, and patients with rare diseases live very far from specialized centers. So patients have to travel long distances to be seen for receiving the appropriate care. This means they have to take time off from work or school, finding someone to take care of children, pets, etc. And the families really need to have the resources to be able to pay for all of these things. And the situation gets even more complicated when patient is a child. In that case, parents need to take time off as well. They may have to arrange for care of siblings, pets, and they may have to pay for expenses for 2 people, which again can be a burden on many families. Patients and families have said that they are willing to take on a lot of burden when gene therapy is investigational. But after a gene therapy is approved, there's a very high bar to go through so much of inconvenience for 15 years, and we think it's justified. In post-marketing settings, sites and ethics committees have a lot of questions on frequency of visits, the testing schedule, and the need for invasive testing. When patients improve after treatment, they and their families want to move on with their lives. When patients feeling well and wanting to move on with their lives is a real great testament to the success of gene therapy, in our opinion. But we also want the patients to be free from the healthcare system as much as possible after getting better. If we want the patients to follow up in long-term follow-up studies for 15 years, so we really need to adapt. And some of the feedback that we have received from patients who have had success with gene therapy has been, they have started college, they are doing full-time work. They want to continue in the long-term follow-up studies and they want to contribute to science, they want to help us out. But it is difficult for them to take time off from work, especially when they have limited sick days or they have to forego wages due to time off. It really is a challenge for these patients to be able to take time off from school or work to be able to come and do the visits that are required. So the second lesson we learned is to listen to the patient and their families. For majority of patients after recovery from treatment, the circumstances have likely changed for the good and will change for the next 15 years. Protocols should be designed to collect data without creating undue burden on patients and their families. When it comes to sites, when we talk to the sites, what they told us that they have a big concern about the burden of data entry. One feedback was that we should try to minimize the burden of data entry into multiple databases. So CBER is an organization in the US which collects data on allogeneic transplant patients, and many sites report data on autologous transplant patients as well. The sites did not want to enter the data twice, first in the CBER database and then in our database. So what we did is we developed a collaboration with CBER to get transplant data from their database. We then combine the CBER data with our data that we collect from other sources, such as the central labs and the adverse event reporting process. So this reduced the burden on the sites in terms of data entry, but it meant a lot more work at our end because we had to develop a process to QC the data and then merge all the data to get full picture of the data. And I want to point out that, we only receive data from CBER once they have consented to the data transfer. These sites were also worried about protocol violations if the schedule of visits was too strict, or there were too many invasive tests, or the frequency of tests was too much. So to minimize protocol violations, we are working on mechanisms like home visits for blood sample collection, televisits, virtual visits. So the third lesson really is to listen to what site staff has to say and collaborate with other stakeholders to build synergies and minimize burden on the sites. I want to bring out an important point. In one of our post-marketing long-term follow-up study, we had a lot of invasive testing. When we analyzed the data, we found that the invasive testing did not help us identify adverse events better than the routine blood tests. We engaged with the FDA and presented our data. After discussion with the FDA, we were able to simplify testing requirements for that protocol. So the fourth lesson is one should be willing to engage with the FDA and other stakeholders when you feel the original plan is not serving the purpose. In a 15-year study, one must continuously review the incoming data and keep ears to the ground to bring out efficiencies. Otherwise, it just becomes very complicated and very challenging for the sites and the patients to do 15-year follow-up. When we started collecting data with CBER, we recognized that we were not getting some of the efficacy information we wanted to collect. So we again collaborated with them to develop additional forms and a process to get these forms completed. This also meant that in one post-marketing long-term follow-up study, we needed to adapt one of the endpoints in such a way that we could assess the endpoint using the CBER data, but also keep a bridge with the endpoint in our registrational study. So the fifth lesson is to really identify the key information one wants from a long-term follow-up study. One should think smart, creatively, and focus on the big picture. One of the challenges we are facing is the requirement of central review of specimens. For example, in one of our studies, there's a requirement that the peripheral smears be read centrally. This requirement poses enormous challenges both for us, the sites, and the patients, because it means we have to bring the patient to the site to collect the blood, and then the blood has to be shipped to the central lab for peripheral smear evaluation. This reduces flexibility in terms of reducing the visits for our patients, because we have to bring them in to the site for collecting the blood. Our suggestion to whoever is doing the long-term follow-up study is try to avoid incorporating central labs in the long-term studies if possible. It may not always be possible, but if you can do it, you should try to limit use of central labs in long-term follow-up study. The other challenge I want to highlight is collection of adverse events in post-marketing setting requires a robust operational process. Most of the database repositories like CIBMTR or other registries will not typically collect adverse events in a very timely manner. So for example, they do collect data on adverse events, but we have to wait for the data transfer every 3 or 6 months if we want to know what is going on. So if we want to know it earlier, we have to develop a process that's slightly different and maybe outside the process of collecting information from the database or the registries. And we have done that. We have created a process outside the registries and the database so that we can get information on the adverse events sooner and before we get the routine transfer at 3 or 6 months from CIBMTR. So to summarize, there can be differences in long-term follow-up studies in pre and post-marketing setting. Our studies are slightly different in the pre-marketing setting and in the post-marketing setting. Our goal for long-term follow-up studies should not be to collect data for the sake of collecting it. That we strongly feel within bluebird bio. Our goal should be to collect data in a meaningful way so that we can help our patients, families, and treating physicians make better decisions. One should really work with the patient community, and treating sites to minimize attrition. One should be willing to compromise on aspects of data collection that are of lower priority. And finally, this is most important, the sponsors, the sites, and regulators should be open to honest evaluation of the impact of the study methods on patients' lives. The protocol should be developed within a realistic framework. There should be a willingness to amend the protocol to optimize the balance needed for patient safety, data collection, and patient retention. We are not there yet, but we at bluebird bio think if we want to successfully conduct long-term follow-up studies, we have to take these studies to the patients through innovative methods like home visits, televisits, virtual visits, instead of the old paradigm of the patients coming to the sites. I do hope that our experience is helpful for those who will be designing long-term follow-up studies. Thank you.
Himal, thank you so much for sharing those perspectives on your experiences and what you've learned and some important lessons for the field. Aimee, would you like to go next?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm going to really focus on speaking from the pediatric space in like academic centers. So we just heard a lot about kind of from a company perspective with larger patient populations and post-marketing. And my experience is really in small clinical studies. You might be treating 10 to 20 patients and still have to do that really rigorous long-term follow-up that's required for like basic safety. And so a lot of what Himal just highlighted as challenges, you can feel it tenfold from a small academic center who might have multiple of these studies going on. And also recognizing that, especially for pediatric patients who are treated for malignant diseases, sometimes they're receiving multiple products at different sites. And so they have to have the same long-term follow-up for each different product. And so there's multiple centers having to organize this follow-up for just a single patient. And so it can get really complicated. And then beyond just kind of the bare minimum of the follow-up for these patients, there's also so much we don't know, right? We worry about the genetic changes to the cells and possible late effects from that. But what about the unknown side effects? The literature and what we know about survivors of pediatric cancer is immense. We know about secondary cancer risks, about cardiac risks, fertility, things like that. But for patients treated with these novel cell therapies and gene therapies, we don't know what that profile looks like, because all the data that's been collected so far in childhood cancer survivors doesn't include patients treated with these novel products because they're so recent. And so really one of the efforts we're trying to look at from the pediatric community is, are these late effects different? So what's the requirement from an FDA perspective? Definitely need to be doing that, but can we do more? Is there an interest from patient and families to do a deeper dive into potentially some of these late effects? Because for some patients, getting a gene therapy might make it so they don't need to receive a bunch of other therapies. So maybe their late effect profile is actually less than if they had gone on to receive transplant or chemotherapy, things like that. Maybe the profile is more because this adds on to all of their other therapy. Or maybe there's really unique side effects from the specific therapy, and from the toxicities that are unique to these gene and cell therapies that we don't even know about yet. And so in the pediatric space, we're really trying to come together, because if we're all treating just small numbers of patients, you're not going to learn enough at an individual center. And so we're trying to have multidisciplinary, multi-center collaboration to really say, can we get patients from across the world, across the states, and study more in-depthly their experience of having gone through CAR T-cell therapy or other gene therapies, as well as what does that late effect profile look like. And that's probably not a realistic endeavor for every patient that receives these products, but can we kind of understand it better so we can help with that counseling. We can talk to patients and families about these potential risks and really improve our informed consent process. Because right now, we have to be honest and say, we don't know some of these things. We're trying to figure it out, but we don't know yet. And so really my goal is to help the community get to a point where we can more definitively say, we know X, Y, and Z, and move on from there.
Thank you so much, Aimee. That's really helpful to hear, doing long-term follow-up studies in different settings, one a commercial setting, and you as a clinician investigator at a nonprofit academic research hospital, and how those challenges are similar and how they're different. I just want to also remind the audience and anybody who's here with us to put questions into the Q&A, and at the end of everyone's sort of short presentation, we'll turn to the Q&A and open that up. So thank you for that. Priya, last but not least.
So thank you. This is great because I feel like the three of you all have touched on some things that I can speak to from the family perspective. And I think some of the things I'm going to bring up are already in the works, but maybe not as accessible from the family perspective. So maybe we're not seeing it as much from our perspective. So there's from the patient family perspective, there's sort of two ways I want to look at it. One is long-term follow-up from the perspective of the patients who have undergone gene therapy and the challenges they face as patients. But the second is the perspective of parents who are potential gene therapy patients as they look at long-term follow-up studies as part of their decision-making process on when they're considering receiving gene therapy. So I just want to start by sharing my experience very briefly. My son was 3 months old when he was diagnosed with Wiskott-Aldrich syndrome. It's a rare disease. It causes dysfunction of the immune system, and so the body's ability to fight infection, as well as very low platelets. So patients are at risk of life-threatening infections and life-threatening bleeding events. The standard treatment for Wiskott is bone marrow transplant. We were told that without a transplant, our son wouldn't make it past his 8th birthday, but he didn't have a good match. And so for him, experimental gene therapy seemed to be the best option. And we had to go to Italy to be part of a clinical trial to make that happen. We lived there for about 5 months for his initial therapy. And now for the first 8 years after gene therapy, we had to travel to Milan yearly for follow-up. After the 8-year mark, it went to every other year or so in person with virtual follow-ups on the off years. We really look forward to the reassurance of checking in with our treatment team, but these visits were definitely logistical challenges, time and expense. Usually our visits to Milan were at least a week to 10 days, especially when my child was little. The large volume of blood that was needed to run all these tests, they couldn't be drawn all at once. They had to be spaced out over several blood draws over a week. There were also imaging studies, evaluations by different specialists that were scheduled over that week. Taking a full week, that's coordination of missing work and school, it's travel time. For my friends who had multiple children, it's arranging childcare for their other kids, as people have discussed. Of course, it would have been really helpful if there had been care coordination that allowed tests to be drawn locally and sent to Milan. As of now, sort of the logistical and regulatory challenges, the study design, all of that made that option very difficult. And so we found that if we, on the virtual visit times, we didn't get the full picture because certain tests couldn't be looked at those times. For us, we were lucky our travel costs to Milan are covered by the investigational trial. But once patients are receiving gene therapy outside of a clinical trial, it's important to consider how they're going to manage those travel costs, whether it's to an international center or to a regional center of excellence. The other challenge that hasn't been touched on today that we and many families have faced is uncertainty when gene therapy IP ownership changes hands from one company to another, or it's dropped entirely. Our trial transitioned from one pharma company to another a few years ago, and the first one went relatively smoothly. But then 2 years ago, due to financial considerations within the company, so nothing to do with success or safety of the therapy, our trial was dropped by the company sponsoring it. There was a period of limbo with no clear certainty of the future of the trial. This is really stressful, you know. Thankfully, a nonprofit entity in Italy, Telethon, has taken over our trial, and huge sigh of relief. But our follow-up visits have been postponed during that time. So you can imagine that's another stressor. And for our patient community, it was a real period of worry for us. So it seems like as we move forward, we need to figure out how do we create infrastructure that supports long-term follow-up that's not dependent on the finances of a company or a center that's conducting a trial. Parents who are looking at this, they want to know if there's going to be stability in the follow-up plan and that they're not going to be left out in the cold. We do also need to look at that length of time and sort of what's being looked at for how much time to make sure that's doable. The second perspective that I want to talk about is of prospective patients who are considering gene therapy. When parents and families are looking at gene therapy, they want to know about safety, right, and effect, but also effectiveness that's shown in long-term follow-up. It's difficult for families to find this information. Maybe it's there, but it's hard for families to see that, to access that information easily. I think for families, the most significant risk that they're thinking about is the development of cancer. Sometimes that data about cancer rates and other potentially serious complication rates aren't published for years. For example, I know that my son is doing great. He's, there's no concern of mutation or cancer. And that his graft has held up. His efficacy is good. And I've been told that the results from the other patients are excellent, but the updated data hasn't been published yet. So that information isn't available to other patients and their doctors. So, there's a delay there, and there's a lack of information for the public. I think most of all, parents and families, they're looking for transparency. People become experts in their child's disease, so they want to be able to compare outcomes of all the available treatment options. They want to see head-to-head comparisons of standard established therapies like bone marrow transplant versus gene therapy. And as Aimee said, there's if gene therapy patients are excluded from a lot of these studies, it's hard to see head-to-head comparisons. Not everyone's looking at the same data. We're not always in those quality of life studies that are long-term. So I haven't seen a good way for families to see this information. Parents want to know about safety and efficacy of gene therapy in general, not just for their disease. So I think it's important for people to be able to look at all the different trials using a particular vector, such as lentivirus. People want to know, they want to know the details. They want to know the pros and cons of different conditioning regimens, differences in protocol, et cetera, because they're getting this information. They want to know what that means for their child. Having all of that data available helps us to make informed decisions as families. And while such safety data is crucial, people want to know about more than mortality and cure. We have the luxury now where cure that's not enough. It's not sufficient. We want to know about quality of life after gene therapy, and it's important to publish this data as much as we publish morbidity and mortality data. When I talk to families, they care about things like feeding difficulties, learning problems, mental health, dental health, skin problems, much more. And it doesn't seem like there's any place for families to easily find this information. Often the way families are learning and connecting and learning about their options is through family support groups, often on social media. That's our reality. And these groups are really valuable, but there's potential for misinformation in these groups. There's potential for anecdotal stories to be taken as data, as truth, right? So it's really important to have collated sources of information, detailed scientific information for the doctors, and then simplified information that's accessible for families. Gene therapy's come so far, and it's been a life-saving therapy for many families. But as it becomes available for more people, we've got to figure out how to make long-term follow-up equitable, accessible for families with varied resources. We need to consider sort of creative ways to make this happen. And we also need to find ways to make the data available in a more timely, transparent way for families and for physicians who are trying to get the information to make their treatment decisions. If they don't happen to be talking to the right people, they don't have that access right now, as far as I've seen. Thanks for listening.
Thank you so much, Priya. I'm really struck by how, the things that you were saying about the information that families who are considering gene therapies need and want in terms of supporting their decision-making is what, Aimee had talked about in terms of hearing from families that she's working with, wanting to know more, wanting to have this long-term data on a variety of outcomes, not just a narrow band of safety outcomes. But sometimes in my work as a bioethicist and where I sit in academia, I can, there's a lot, oftentimes we can find a lot of challenges, and there's not as many solutions that are as sort of, low-hanging fruit. Solutions are certainly harder. Recently I've come upon the thinking that, challenges, identifying challenges actually gets us at least part of the way, because we have at least clarified what we want to solve. And then a lot of times when people talk about challenges, the flip is pointing to some kind of a solution, right? So when you were saying that patients want more information, and then also saying we need data transparency. So that's sort of pointing towards the solution right there. But sometimes getting the actual practical realization of that solution is difficult, as we all know. But so I wanted, before we go to the audience Q&A, I wanted to just give everyone a chance. And again, when you were talking and giving us your perspectives about long-term follow-up and your involvement with long-term follow-up, we did hear about challenges and lessons from Himal about how, they've learned, for example, to approach, long-term follow-up studies by very carefully considering patient perspectives on what should be measured, for example, and cite feedback on, process. But I wanted to give everybody a chance about, reflecting on, and it could be just wild, crazy ideas that are not necessarily easily realizable, or pie in the sky ideas. Aimee's mentioning, collaboration across researchers and sites and centers to, do long-term follow-up studies potentially together. So I just wanted to give everybody a chance to, hypothesize about potential solutions. Aimee, I don't know if you want to go first.
Yeah, I mean, we've thought about this a lot. So recognizing that the work that I'm talking about that we're doing is still a very defined patient population and a very small number of patients. And I think as we're trying to roll out a new study where we can do that comprehensive kind of head to toe testing, all the kind of quality of life measures, ask about these questions, like Priya was mentioning, it's another burden on the families, right? So we're talking about a one visit once a year is really hard. And what if we want you to come for 4 or 5 days to do this battery of testing and actually fill out all the forms and things like that? So I think my wish is that from this, we can maybe come up with a core group of things that we can more easily disperse. So is there a way to say, from a registry standpoint, you're administering some of these surveys with like a key curated question list to patients and families, recognizing that the data might not be complete, right? Because every parent and patient, they're experts on themselves, but they may not realize or not know what they don't know, if you will, and may not be able to report things in the way that makes it consistent across groups. So I think if we can better understand what some of these late effects are, what patients and families want, then maybe we can narrow the scope a little bit, not as narrow as we currently have for a lot of the studies, but not as broad as we maybe could do, to try to make it more feasible, approachable, and sustainable. Because I think that's the biggest thing. As new products come out, late effects for one product or one patient population may be very different for a different product or a different patient population. And so we want to be able to have something that can be kind of plugged and played across these different groups, so we can still learn from everybody that's treated, but try to minimize that burden at the same time.
Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, finding that right balance and Himal, I think also mentioned this, finding that right balance of what outcomes should be followed. I guess that's also another question about, you know, how much standardization on these long-term follow-up protocols there should be to enable comparison across products, you know, diseases, and enable learning, not only from a data transparency standpoint, but also from, you know, even amongst professionals and scientists themselves, like how much value can be drawn from the data that is collected. Najat, I don't know if you'd like to add anything about this.
One thing I would just add to what has been said already is that you know patients and their families, care partners, advocates have really the unique firsthand perspective of what it is like to live with and to care for individuals with the disease. You know, how does that impact their you know, daily life, as Priya said. You know, we at the FDA, we really value patients' voice. Patients can provide valuable input into the discussion of investigational therapies. They describe their experience with the disease or the condition, and they, you know, define meaningful change in terms of their specific disease and risks that they are willing to accept. We, especially our office at OTP, we welcome the participation of patients and their advocates in formal meetings related to the development of investigational products in general, and you know, the study design of protocols in general, and you know, that includes long-term follow-up protocol designs. So sponsors who wish to include patients and their advocates in their meetings with us can really directly invite them, coordinate participation with them, you know, as guests, and welcome their input, because we really, you know, consider it very valuable when we discuss these long-term follow-ups with the sponsors. So I just wanted to mention that. Hopefully that's helpful.
Yeah, that's very helpful. And I know the FDA has been hosting listening sessions, including yesterday's, about, you know, getting patient feedback on early enrollment into gene therapy clinical trials, meaning, you know, enrolling at early stages of disease, potentially even pre-symptomatic stages of disease. And I know that they've had listening sessions on long-term follow-up specifically as well.
Correct. Yeah, and those are mainly focused on post-approvals. So the session, we had, you know, several listening sessions. There was one back in 2023 where we just, you know, opened it up to all, you know, stakeholders to hear their perspective on, you know, what are methods and approaches that could be utilized that could help the design of long-term follow-ups post-approval. And we heard from patients and advocates and industry that, you know, the use of real-world evidence and real-world data can be helpful. We heard that patient registries can be very insightful and helpful in collection of data. And most importantly, decentralized clinical trials. We heard a lot about, you know, can we, you know, collect the data in a way where the patient does not have to come to the center, where, especially in pediatric patients, when they, you know, reach college, when they travel, you know, away from this center where they were treated, how can they still continue with the follow-up? How can we incentivize their retention and, you know, like to continue in that follow-up? So obviously, you know, decentralized clinical trials, I think, could be definitely helpful in terms of ensuring that we continue to collect the data, because as you know, the field of gene therapy is really relatively new. You know, the first approval was in 2017. We have, 22 products. So we at the FDA, along with the investigators and sponsors and patients, we are learning. And still, there are risks that we know about. There are risks that, there are unknown, and there are this that are, theoretical. So we just don't know. So I think only time can really, help us understand the late effects of these treatments. And, when talking to patients and patients advocates, sometimes the question comes, do we, especially for pediatric patients, when they receive gene therapies that are integrated into their genome, maybe editing their genome, how long do we need to follow them up? Right now we say 15 years based on what we know right now. Is that going to change? Do we need to follow them lifetime? Some say it's too much. Some say, we need to. So I think we just, we learn as the field grows and as we gather more information. That's why LTFUs, long-term follow-ups are really important, critical, so that we can, continue to inform our decision and continue to balance of the risk and benefit of these products as they come more available to our patients.
That's really helpful. And that actually relates to one of the questions in the chat, which is, what's the rationale for the duration of long-term follow-up studies? And, why would it be 5 years, 15 years, or lifetime? How is that determined? Do you want to you started to explain.
Yes. So I think right now it's mainly depends on the product itself and our knowledge of the, the disease, the underlying disease and the product. Some products use certain vectors that go and integrate into the genome. And we need to follow these patients for longer because the genome might change over time. There might be secondary malignancies that can develop over time. And in certain products where there is no manipulation to the genome, maybe or less likelihood of integration, we might recommend 5 years of follow-up. And in some products where there's minimal manipulation to the genome, there might not be as longer follow-up as 5 years. So it depends really on the products mainly, and also sometimes it depends on the disease. As we know, like pediatric patients, when they receive other therapies such as transplant, chemotherapy, they already have an underlying baseline of, perhaps they're going to have a higher chance of developing secondary malignancies from those therapies. So we need to monitor those in addition to the therapy that they receive in terms of gene therapy.
Thank you so much. That's really helpful. And I mean, in terms of my own, reading about this, I think also that the 15-year came about from a historical experience. There was a late adverse event that happened, but again, as Najat is saying, I think it's still a period of learning, and so that may well answer, that may well change as the experience and knowledge grows. Priya, I wanted to just give you a chance to, speak a little bit about this possibility for decentralized long-term follow-up. And when you were talking about your personal experiences with long-term follow-up, you mentioned that, there was a delay because of the transition. But, it seems as though you would have also been receiving, regular annual visits. And so can you speak to the fact, how the annual visits, like whether that data from regular clinical care could be sent, or was it sent, or, or is it just a complete separation? And do you envision that could be changed in the future if there was a separation?
So I think it's a complicated answer. I think that it depends. So yes, locally we can get basic lab data, right? But there are tests that one for part of the protocol, but that the protocol required that they be done in central centralized lab testing, right? So at the center for their protocol, but also some of those tests are not done in other places, right? So vector counts and sort of looking at the insertion site and all of those kind of things, you know, they were very specific to the center that developed our gene therapy. So as a parent, you know, you always have that anxiety, right? And so it's great to see that basic immune function is good on our local immunologists' lab testing. But I really want to know. I want to know sort of to make sure that there's no insertion site issues, that that all of the, you know, the WASP protein presence and the percentages and all of those things from the same site are still acceptable. So, you know, we're 13 years out. I shouldn't be anxious anymore, but of course I'm anxious a little bit, you know. So I'm still looking forward, as we're probably 6 or 8 months behind on when we should be in our follow-up, and we still don't have a date for our next follow-up. So yeah, that creates a fair amount of anxiety in me. The other issue, you know, when my son was little, there was a point in the first 6 months where he was way too sick to travel, and it got complicated. He was due for his first bone marrow, and he had been in and out of the ICU. He had a pretty complicated course, and he was due for his bone marrow follow-up, and we were on pins and needles to know whether the treatment was working or whether things were okay. And there was actually a debate at his home hospital about whether they were allowed to do a bone marrow, and because it wasn't medically necessary for his immediate care, but it was necessary to see whether his treatment had worked. And there was a big debate about, well, he's not, you know, we don't have IRB approval in this institution. We're not part of this study. So are we really allowed to do it? And, you know, basically, I think he was sick enough that there was justification made to do it. But I was appalled as a parent that, you know, my kid received this therapy to save his life. And then there was actual, you know, quibbling about the protocol and whether it was really okay to do it. And I understand it. I understand it as a physician. I understand the ethics and the need to be proper about doing these things. But as a parent, you know, you to like anyone, please. My kid just needs the care, you know, and so it's trying to figure out how do you figure out these logistics. And then there's sort of along with that, there's this issue if you're going to do lifetime follow up, say, you know, how do you handle insurance? Who's paying for this when you're not on a study protocol? What about this kid who now is 28 and off their parents' insurance, and they don't have good insurance anymore? Is it going to cover all these lab tests? We definitely had to, on our off years when we've had lab tests, extensive lab testing done, we've had to send things in multiple times to get them approved by insurance. And I'm pretty sure I got a lot of professional courtesy, you know, not getting balance billed on some of those things because insurance isn't used to seeing these, and it's not a simple thing. So I think that those are issues that need to be looked at as well when you're looking at decentralizing testing. And one more thing, just as we're talking about you know, like the wanting registries right now, even for rare diseases in general, there aren't that many good registries out there. As we work with our foundation, for example, we don't have a good registry of patients that has all this information to count on individual patient organizations to make these registries. These are expensive, big, you know, labor-intensive endeavors. My pie in the sky would be to have someone take care of that for us. You know, whether it's the NIH or somebody, have good disease registries that are accessible, that people can enter data in, that, you know, everybody can work together to have data collection and data sharing in some place where it's not dependent on, you know, my tiny organization doing fundraising to figure out and then figuring out how to, you know, make that happen. It's a lot. So that's
Yeah, so that's, I mean, so I'm going to go to Aimee on this because I think Aimee has similar aspirations to what you're saying in terms of, first of all, I also want to acknowledge that, you know, what you bring up with this, you know, the long-term follow-up and the separation of clinical care and the trial. It's interesting because, you know, you brought up so many examples of the complications. including the complication of the fact that in these types of scenarios, the research becomes, care. It's an integration, and so some of our protocols can actually get in the way in these cases. Aimee, I wanted to go to you to sort of, take what Priya was saying about, collaboration and building sort of systems of registries, which is what I think you were sort of starting to talk about. And also, just to add on, I want to also address some of the questions in the chat, which might relate to this, which is, how can professional organizations such as the ACGME or AAP contribute to registry outcomes that might be helpful across patient groups? And someone else asked, how can patient advocate groups help support these efforts? So, I was wondering if you wanted to expand on what you started talking about, what you're working on.
Yeah. I mean, so taking experience from the large amount of work that's been put into late effects of survivors of pediatric cancer, right? From all of that work of collecting data on patients and collating it and looking for these risk factors and potential outcomes based on prior therapy, there are now guidelines in place that survivors can be empowered to take to their primary doctor and say, because I was exposed to X drug, I need an echo every so many months. And with those guidelines, I mean, they have been approved and like multiple groups involved to help with insurance coverage and things like that, to try to empower the local physicians that may never have more than one patient who receives these therapies in their office. And so that's where like the professional organizations one caught my eye from a question, because I think one of the things is we're not there yet to do that. We need to get the data to help inform the guidelines to then disperse them. But I think that dispersion piece is going to be key. Like, how do we educate not just patient and families, but all the docs that see these patients, right? Like, these therapies are becoming more and more used in both pediatrics and adults. So with that, it's more and more likely that a doctor of any subspecialty will have a patient in their practice that has received these therapies. And so helping with that education and some of these guidelines might help them to say, even if they're not contributing data from that follow-up to a registry, because that's not impossible to do, but that would be logistically, again, we'll talk about ownership and kind of burden on people, but at least be aware of what the possible side effects are, what they should be monitoring for on a basic level. So if they see something, then what do they do with that information, right? So it may not be a registry that just collects all the normal info, but at least a place to be able to deposit something is going on with my patient that is different, that might be related to their prior gene therapy. And then that can then trigger a cascade of more specialized follow-up, for example. So the efforts we're doing is really specific, again, to patients who received CD19 directed CAR T-cell therapy in a specific time frame, et cetera, but it's supposed to be a starting point to try to get some of that rich data across all these different organ systems and quality of life indices and neurologic function, development, all of that, to help inform upon even bigger efforts to get to those guidelines, because those didn't happen overnight. But I think that we absolutely can lean on some of these organizations to help us not only recruit patients potentially for these efforts, maybe to support some of the infrastructure for these efforts. And then really, once we have the data and the information, how do we get it back to the people who really need it?
Aimee, that's really helpful, because not only you're talking about the infrastructure and building what we need to know about, to get the knowledge generated, but also not the data, the what's learned, not only going back to the patient community, which of course is so important, as Priya was saying, but also to the physicians who will be supporting them in their care going forward after they receive these products, either in a research setting or in the commercial setting. I think there's an education that needs to happen. As Najat was saying, this is a new therapeutic class. And so the education even of physicians, they need support as well about what they should be looking out for, and how they can support their patients.
It's a great problem to have, right? That they're well enough that they're no longer seeing their hematologist oncologist anymore, or their pediatric person anymore. But then they're out there and they don't even realize necessarily. We have lots of young men in our in our community that have no idea that they should probably continue to get specialized monitoring after a bone marrow transplant, for example.
Yeah, and Priya, do you want to address this question in the chat about someone asked, people have used the analogy that receiving gene therapy is similar to getting an organ transplant in terms of burden and follow-up commitments. Understanding that some ex vivo gene therapies also require a bone marrow transplant, are in vivo gene therapies similar in terms of the follow-up and considerations? So, you know, do you want to answer that as both a physician and someone who's been through it?
I mean, I can answer the part about, sorry. I'm not muted. I can answer the part about, you know, definitely, if you've had bone marrow ablation as part of your gene therapy, I think that the considerations are very similar. And it gets really confusing trying to sort out, okay, what part of my child's issues are from gene therapy, what part is from their disease process itself, what part is from getting chemo at the age of 12 months, you know? And again, some of this stuff, our numbers are so small that sometimes we're figuring stuff out through conversations among patients. Like I just had a conversation about dental enamel with another mom who got gene therapy for a different disease. And so all this time I was thinking, oh, it must be a Wiskott thing, or and maybe it's a chemo thing. But now I found out, okay, her son was treated at the same time. And both of us had the issue come up around the 8-year mark when we stopped seeing the dentist as part of our yearly in-person follow-up, you know, so it probably isn't captured in the center data. And that's, so I think that that's where that like exposure to chemo and everything is really very similar. Sorry if I digressed, but, and I honestly, I'm not sure that I can answer the question about the in vivo. I think someone else might be able to answer that question better.
Okay, thank you so much for sharing that. Himal, I wanted to give you a chance if you had anything you wanted to add to, you know, that you didn't get to mention.
Yeah, thank you. I think, you know, Priya mentioned the kind of data patients are looking for, the families are looking for. And there was, you know, mention of quality of life, comparative data, et cetera, et cetera. I think, you know, again, it goes back to the point of creating a balance between what information you want to collect and the burden on the patient and the site in terms of collection. So, you know, and you also have to recognize that the more data you add or the more endpoints or more information you collect in a long-term follow-up study, then it essentially replicates a clinical trial. And that's not really the intent of the long-term follow-up study. So, you know, I mean, are these things doable? Absolutely. I mean, in all our long-term follow-up studies, we do collect quality of life data to some extent. We do collect efficacy data in all our 6 studies because we want patients to know what the durability and the efficacy is in long term. But again, you really don't want to turn a long-term follow-up study into a 15-year clinical trial with the same kind of intensive monitoring, et cetera. I mean, so some of our studies, the one for clinical trial patients, we do intensive monitoring like in their 2-year parent study, but you have to create a distinction between that and a long-term follow-up study in a post-marketing setting. Again, you can adapt the post-marketing setting a little bit, like we have adapted, but you know, you have to be very careful of finding that balance. You also don't want a lot of missing data in long-term follow-up studies. Putting questionnaires is easy, but then if you're not getting the questionnaires completed and you're not getting the right information, that adds a lot of burden. And it's also very expensive to collect these information over 15 years. So I think, you know, I think it really has to be a real balance between what we are trying to get from our long-term follow-up studies. And I think, you know, to expect one organization, whether it's a company or NIH or someone else, to take on the burden of everything is going to be very challenging. I think it will require a very good collaboration between patient care organizations, maybe registries, maybe NIH, maybe industry, maybe, you know, gene therapy organizations to be able to come up with a broad plan to be able to collect some of the information we want to really collect.
Yeah, thank you so much. That's, I mean,
yeah.
as you say, I think, you know, a lot of the conversation today has pointed to, you know, challenges that perhaps no one entity can solve on its own. It had, you know, thinking about what should be collected, you know, at the minimum needs to involve the patients to figure out what outcomes are important in the FDA. And so it seems definitely something that needs a collaborative approach to, you know, in terms of moving forward. There's one last question that I just wanted to get to about, you know, and this is actually in the FDA guidance, I believe, about, you know, situations where companies developing a gene therapy go out of business. And you know, Priya mentioned that the trial she was involved with has been handed over to 2 different organizations after the original organization. Najat, I don't know if you want to comment on how, I know in the guidance it says, you know, companies that have difficulty should reach out to the FDA, not to kick the can to the FDA, but so what happens in those types of scenarios? It seems very challenging, but how is that approached?
So yeah, we do take those cases on case by case basis. So whenever we hear about a company that is no longer in business and some patients need to be followed up, we try to go to the investigators and just reach out to them, because these patients are being followed up by physicians. You know, like, you know, we would reach out to someone who's like Aimee and be like, you know, we have this patient received this therapy at this center. Can you please let us know, are they still following up? Can you submit? Because, you know, late or like long-term follow-up, you need, most of the time it's like a yearly follow-up. It's, you know, so we just need like once a year, like what's happening to these patients? Are they still following up? Are they still, you know, getting some of their testing done? That's have been, you know, like our approach with the few cases that approached us when the companies were no longer in business.
That's really helpful. Thank you so much. And it's good to hear that's those efforts are made to try and, you know, preserve the data collection. I think we're running we're running out of time. I want to just take, before I hand it over to Aiden to wrap us up, I want to express my thanks to every single panelist. Thank you for being willing to come here, share your perspective, share your viewpoints, talk about challenges so openly. We are very appreciative of it. And I know the audience, I can speak on behalf of them, it also appreciates it very much as well. Aiden, I don't know if you want to take over, and thank you so much.
Thank you. So we're out of time, and I'd also like to take a moment to thank all of our panelists for the great discussion today, as well as all of the attendees for your thoughtful questions. Please be sure to tune into tomorrow's panel, Data Sharing in the Gene Therapy Space. We've kind of touched on a couple questions related to that today, I think, and we'll have an opportunity to expand on that conversation tomorrow. A registration link has been shared in the chat for that. On behalf of PGTME, I would like to thank all who have attended, participated, or helped put this webinar together. I'd also like to remind you that PGTME exists courtesy of charitable donations, and if you are interested in supporting our educational initiatives, please contact our co-chair, whose name and email address have been shared in the chat. And with that, I will close us out. Thanks so much, everybody, and have a great rest of your day.